This is the last chapter in the social psych book, and the last chapter then we'll be talking about. Let's see. In the past semesters, I haven't even gotten here because there's so many other things going on. This year, in coming to this chapter, I realized how important it is, and I will prioritize actually talking about this chapter. I think it's a really, really good one, and I hope you get something out of what I have to present on it. Most of this chapter is about social dilemmas, and the definition of a social dilemma is a situation in which the goals of the individual conflict with the goals of the group. So that can be a problem. You have some options. You can cooperate to try to get some of each group's needs met, the individual or the larger group. You can compete. Actually, one nice thing about competition, especially in times of crisis, that forces people, companies, everything to adapt and sometimes improve their methods. So sometimes competition can result in some good things. Or there can be just outright conflict, which then may harm one group or another. One of the questions on many dilemmas that needs to be asked first is this a fixed sum game? That means, is it true that only one person could win? Or is it integrative? Is it possible that all could realize benefits if cooperation happened? So integrative versus fixed sum are terms that are tossed about on a regular basis for real world social dilemmas like the amount of oil and petroleum in the world, the rainforest, things like that. There's something called realistic conflict theory, and that is the idea that limited resources leads to conflicts between two groups. When there's two groups that are in conflict, there's going to be increased out-group hostility and increased in-group favoritism and loyalty to the in-group. A lot of times this conflict between groups results in prejudice and discrimination, dehumanizing the out-group, and people who end up with the resources using the just world belief to justify that, well, it's only fair, we won, so we deserve the goods. Also, it involves people who lose the conflict to be the victim of victim blaming. Well, you didn't work hard enough. In this chapter, they also describe morality, and we're going to talk a little bit about a piece of that in terms of how it relates to fairness and justice. So, as you know, morality has some cognitive parts and some emotional aspects to it. Morals are typically agreed upon by members of the culture. Conventional morality is just norms that are seen as appropriate but unrelated to doing harm or good to other people. So it's like conventional morality might say that you don't fart at the dinner table. It's just good manners. But does anybody really get harmed or benefiting from that rule? So that's not, that's just kind of the customs, procedures, standards of appropriate behavior that really don't have much to do with harm or good. Harm-based morality is the universal principle that harming others or violating their rights is wrong. And actually that is the first ethical principle of psychologists and medical doctors: do no harm. As you know from things like the Tuskegee experiment, that has been violated in the past, but the ethic, the aspirational ethic, is to do no harm. Related to morality is the concept of fairness, and related to ethics is so what is fair? And there's two different ways of thinking about this. One is called distributive fairness. The other is called procedural fairness. Distributive fairness is if a person perceives this, they perceive that people are receiving a fair share of the available resources, rewards, rights, often based on receiving in proportion to one's contribution. Typically, most people think of socialist policies and programs as being based on distributive fairness. From each according to their ability, to each according to their needs is a phrase often uttered in more socialist. I'll say that again. From each according to their ability, so how much effort and work you throw into the collective whole, that depends on what you're capable of, and to each according to their needs. And then the whole, the collective, will return to you what you need to survive and thrive, hopefully. Procedural fairness is a different thing. It's a way of doing goods and rewards, dishing those out in terms of rules. And the question is, are those rules perceived as fair? So if a person perceives that there's procedural fairness in the US, they're going to think, yeah, I may not have everything I want, but I think the way that the society is running is fair and good. Belief in procedural fairness is easy for people who have a lot of privilege, something we just talked about in the last chapter, because it's like, yeah, I got my good, so it must work. It must be fair. It must be working. There's no motivation for people who are in the elite groups to change the system at all. But if a person lacks privilege and they perceive that society is fair because of procedural fairness, then they're typically, what that person is going to be motivated to do is to change their own status in society. So instead of being lower economically classed, being more middle class or upper class, and work harder and harder and harder to try to like keep the system the way it is, but move up in the levels within the system. So actually, if you look at this research graph I have here, this was asking people at different income brackets. Basically, do you agree that large income differences are necessary in a society? And what you see is the people who make the least amount of money agree with that, which is kind of mind-blowing. One thing that could be related to this is one's own spiritual or religious worldviews. So if you perceive procedural fairness also including what happens in the afterlife, then a person may tell themselves, then it's fair in the long run and I will get my rewards later. The problem with that is there's no motivation to change the current system as it exists on Earth, and the same unfairnesses continue to exist. So there are all sorts of social dilemmas. We're going to talk about a few of those. Again, the most rewarding short-term choice for the individual causes negative outcomes for the group. One of these is the dilemma of the commons. This is when there's common resource space that is shared amongst a group of people, and it's tempting for any one of the individual members to use more of it. So it's actually based on what used to be called common ground. Like in Boston, one of the earlier cities in the US, there was Boston Commons, and that's where farmers would bring their cattle to graze, but everyone knew that this is a shared resource, so you can't overgraze that area with your cattle, or nobody else will have any grazing ground for their cattle. This creates problems. Obviously, like the rainforest, it's a global resource that we need for reduction of carbon dioxide. But because individuals have an invested interest in getting some short-term profits from grazing cattle, a lot of the rainforest has been coming down. So that is a result of the dilemma of the commons. Also, there is something called the metal nuts game, which I think is interesting. You can imagine with M&Ms. If I say you and like 4 of your classmates down at a table, and I said, here's a bowl, it's got like 50 M&Ms in it, and the goal is to get as many M&Ms as you can. And assume that everyone likes M&Ms, and so I'm going to put the bowl there. Take out as many as you want, but if you take out just a little bit slowly at a time, after a 15-second interval, I will double the amount of M&Ms that's in that bowl. Every 15 seconds, I'll do that. And so ultimately, as you can probably guess, the whole deal would be to talk with each other and say, let's wait an hour, we'll have thousands of M&Ms, and then we all take home a bunch. But that's not what typically happens. What typically happens is the bowl sits there, and people start taking some, and then taking more, and most groups who are posed with that dilemma, 65%, 2/3, don't make it 10 seconds into this game. That's just astounding. I mean, part of the reason for that is there's social loafing, and you have fear and greed mixed into that. Also, there's something called the contributions dilemma. I put in there Stephen King. It's talked about in your book. He said that he would write a new chapter of his book for his fans if enough people contributed money. And nobody did. Everyone wanted it for free. So he just stopped writing chapters. You may be familiar with that. Even in Wikipedia, they ask for money for those who are using the site because it's like, this isn't free to have this going on. So we need people to use it to contribute. Same with public radio. If you listen to that, it requires funds, but nobody wants to. People say, why should I? Again, social loafing. Let them, diffusion of responsibility, contribute to that. Next dilemma that I'm going to briefly talk about is the prisoner's dilemma. I have an assignment for you based on that on Canvas. When you look at that, it's, I'll just read a little bit here. The prisoner's dilemma involves a situation in which two prisoners have been accused of committing a crime. The police have determined that the two worked together on a crime, but they have only been able to gather enough evidence to convict each of them of a more minor offense. In an attempt to gain more confidence and thus to be able to convict the prisoners of the larger crime, each prisoner is interrogated individually with the hope that he will confess to having been involved in the more major crime in return for a promise of a reduced sentence. So each prisoner can make the cooperative choice, which is to not confess, cooperating with each other, or the competitive choice, confess, and if I confess, then I get 0 prison sentence, and my buddy is going to get 30 years. So this is what the chart looks like. If I confess, let's say I'm Malik up here at top, I get 0, Frank gets 30 years. If we both don't confess, we just each get 3 years. I'm pointing to the screen, you can't see that. But if we both basically work on the competitive edge and we both confess, hoping that we'll be the one getting the 0, then we both get 10 years, which is still not very good. So they work on this in a number of ways, trying to figure out what is, and so if you have each person make their decision separately, come together, share that, you can do this on a repeated basis to see if you can get any change in how this unfolds. And that is the nature of the assignment that I have for you on Canvas. So I'm not going to say too much more about that. I'd like you to do that and tell me what you find. If you think about it in terms of, I mean, that's the dilemma of competition in the real world. There's been that too. The arms race that happened, well, now it's building up again between the US and Russia. It's like, oh, you have more nuclear arms, we'll get more. If you get more, then we'll get even more. You get more, then we get more. And if it starts out competitively, eventually it can result in some pretty negative consequences. The arms agreements that happened, SALT I, SALT II, there were treaties between the US and Russia, was a movement towards like, I'll give a little bit if you give a little bit. We'll dismantle some of these missiles if you dismantle some of these missiles. That's called a tit for tat strategy. Basically, like if I respond cooperatively, hopefully you will too. However, if the other opponent, the other person, doesn't respond cooperatively after you have, then you match their style. That's what a tit for tat strategy is. And then they'll realize, oh, if I'm going to go cooperative, you're going to go cooperative too. Or if I'm going to go competitive, you're going to go competitive too. It's going to be better for both of us to just keep choosing cooperative. The trucking dilemma is another dilemma with a lot of verbiage here. I want you to read about it and think about it. This is about how if two people own 2 different companies and there's only a limited resource of a 1-lane road, how can that be negotiated so that profits are maximized? What you see, and it's described in the book, if there's a gate allowed to be controlled by each company, that's when the profits dwindle to the least, because then you get people using that gate punitively or in a punishing way. And then you just get the competition building and building and building. When there's no gate for either person, as you can see on this graph here, it's showed in your book, the profits end up being higher. That's the very first set of bar graphs that you see there. Let's see, I think there's just a couple other things I want to talk about for this chapter, and that includes the dual concern model. From the beginning of the book, your authors have talked about there are 2 basic motivations: concern for self, concern for other. And it's possible to have high concerns about both. And when that happens, you have high concerns about your own outcome and high concerns about the other person's outcome. Typically, that moves towards a problem-solving approach. Your book talks things about things like negotiation and mediation, which I want you to read about. Last, factors in increasing cooperation. You can force cooperation by setting up regulating agencies. You can educate people about the consequences of not cooperating, and also educate them about the skills and strategies to cooperate. I mean, that tit for tat strategy is one of them. Also, another strategy that has been used in diplomacy amongst countries is to have a diplomat come in and say, okay, what are you most willing to give on in this, and then ask the other party the same thing, and then realize if they can take both those things that the other two parties are most willing to give up, that may result in a compromise that works out for everybody. If you encourage people to identify with a group, that usually involves cooperation. I know at Lincoln, when we've been really low on financial resources, there is almost propaganda to identify with a Lincoln family, and using slogans like doing more with less resources. Let's see, what else do I want to say? Talking is huge. The more you can talk, the more cooperation happens. That is probably one of the best strategies to think about in terms of dealing with these sorts of dilemmas. When individuals, companies, countries refuse to talk, that's when things tend to end up more destructively and competitively. That's all I have for this chapter and this semester. I hope this has helped.